For those of you that weren't here yesterday, I'll just say hi. I'm Jen Roberts, UKCCSRC Deputy Director and University of Strathclyde Senior Lecturer there up in Glasgow. So hi, today I'm going to be chairing this first session around CO2 storage together with Stuart Haszeldine. Stuart. Okay, hi Stuart. So the way that I'm going to do this is I'll basically chair the first bit, which is our invited speaker presentations, and then I'll hand over to Stuart to the panel discussion that comes afterwards. So this morning we're going to be going on a journey of CO2 storage, and we're going to be channeling from the kind of global perspectives through regulatory perspectives through to the project level, and we're going to be channeling from the kind of academic through down to the industry as well. So there's two types of CO2 storage journeys we're going to be on this morning. We're going to have quick fire presentations, about 10 minutes each. Hold your questions, because we'll have time to tackle those in the 20-25 minutes plenary at the end. Okay, so without further ado, I'll hand over to our first speaker this morning, Professor Sam Krevor. I'm not doing any lengthy introductions, so if you want to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Yeah, that's great. Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Jen. Thanks for the invitation to speak here. It's great to be at another UKCCS Research Centre meeting. Been talking about the importance of this network, both personally and I think to research on carbon capture and storage in the UK. So I'll start off the session. I'm talking about a project called the London Register of Subsurface Carbon Dioxide Storage. This is a particularly single-minded project where all we are trying to do is gather and publish and make publicly available the data on annual amounts of carbon dioxide stored worldwide. I'd like to acknowledge Dr. Zhao Gao, who's the executive director of this, doing a lot of the heavy lifting for this data compilation. And I'll start with some of the motivations, the importance of public data on the amounts of carbon dioxide stored. So firstly, the central compilation of this hadn't existed, and there are a number of stakeholders with varied interests in this data. So I'm highlighting four that I think are particularly important that we hear about time and again. We see users of the data, and I'll start with public acceptance. We had a really fantastic session yesterday afternoon talking about some of these issues, and the framework of public acceptance for technology in general is one in which perception of the benefits of a technology are pitted against the perceptions of the risks. And for carbon capture and storage, while there are many benefits, the leading benefit, and this is perceived by the public, you see it in surveys time and again, the leading benefit is the environmental benefit. Whether or not carbon capture and storage is mitigating climate change. And there's no stronger evidence of that than simply describing how much carbon dioxide has been stored annually worldwide. A second motivation is to address this issue that CCS is or is not a proven technology. So we hear that a lot, that CCS is unproven, and this is really important for policymakers who are thinking about how to lay out their technology roadmaps for climate change mitigation. It's important for business to think about investment and whether or not an industry is arising and what the potential is, and demonstrating how much carbon dioxide is being stored around the world. It shows the scale and variety of deployment. So here I have a schematic from a paper. This is just a cartoon, which illustrates what geological carbon dioxide storage is. So we have carbon dioxide captured from anthropogenic sources and stored underground in various geological systems. But the schematic was drawn in a very deliberate way to not just show what carbon dioxide storage is, but where it is actively being deployed today at industrial scales. And what it illustrates is that there are a wide variety of both industrial settings where the carbon dioxide is captured, how it's being transported, how it's being injected, and where, and also geological settings. It's being injected into oil fields and being used with enhanced oil recovery. You have injection into anticlinal or dome traps. You have systems where a gravity-assisted trapping is being used. You have fault seals where the carbon dioxide is collecting up against the fault. And all of that demonstrates the scale and variety of deployment. It addresses this issue of whether or not this technology is proven. The third comes back to the environmental benefit. This question of what is the contribution that carbon capture and storage is making to climate change? This is the core purpose of the technology, and we can't quantify this unless we know how much carbon dioxide is being stored. And then an issue which is a bit more academic, but has huge impacts on policy, is our understanding of the future potential, our models of how quickly we can scale up carbon dioxide storage. We're going to hear about this in one of the next presentations, are made immensely more accurate if we have good data on where we are today. So a final point I'd like to make about this is discussing the contribution, the value of carbon capture and storage. So we hear a lot as well about the relevance of this technology to climate change. And what I'd like to do is start to socialize this idea that we can actually define what it means to be a climate relevant technology. So very conveniently, some of my colleagues at Imperial College have recently updated what's known as the Climate Wedge paper, where we look at carbon dioxide emissions historically and how by 2050 we can get them to net zero, and we divide up the amount of mitigation into various technologies into wedges. And so by 2050, various technologies contributing of order gigatons of CO2 mitigation per year, these are really the technologies that are climate relevant. And there aren't very many of them, but CCS certainly is one that has potential. But equally important is the concept of the wedge, because whereas at 2050 we're at a gigaton per year, it doesn't mean that the technology is not climate relevant until we get there. This allows us to identify the trajectory to say whether or not we're on track for this technology to be contributing significantly to net zero. So if we're on this trajectory, and here we now have historical information on carbon dioxide stored, looking forward to projections of what might be useful to mitigate global warming to less than 2 degrees Celsius, we can start to address that question. So this is where the London Register of Subsurface Carbon Dioxide Storage comes in. We're filling the data gap. I've said it's very single-minded. We're working with organizations like the Global CCS Institute, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, that maintain the International Energy Agency, that maintain databases of CCS activity. And we're providing a complementary column of information in that data. Again, how much carbon dioxide is stored. It's important for us that this is publicly available and transparent. We also have a third-party assessment of the report, so we contract with DNV. Not only are the database and the report available, but the assessment of our data management practice is also publicly available for everyone to read and assess. So we're continuing. Our next report is going to be published in October. To give you a bit of insight into what's under the hood, we are taking a very rigorous approach to our data management practice, so using international standards and summarizing essentially the workflow and the standards and the principles of these standards. Are 4 points here that we're striving for: completeness in the data, we're striving for understandability so that users can understand what the numbers are, where they've come from, traceability so they can actually access the primary materials and information, whether that be a report, an annual report from a company, or the input to a survey that we've sent out, and of course the accuracy, that we've recorded the data correctly, and we've also provided context on the meaning of the data that we've received from operating projects. And that brings us to a question that we get a lot, which is, what is our definition of carbon dioxide storage? And the answer to that is that we don't define carbon dioxide storage. The definition of carbon dioxide storage is provided by the reporting standards that operators use to quantify that storage. So for example, in the United States, for a project to qualify as having stored carbon dioxide, until recently, they had to file a report with the US Environmental Protection Agency under the Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program, Subpart RR, and it specifies in great detail what it means for them to have quantify the amount of CO2 stored. So there are varying standards that are used, and we provide all of that information in the database so people can assess the meaning of the numbers that we've compiled. I've already mentioned, but there are three data products available: an annual report and a website, which are essentially our user-friendly summaries of the data, and then a raw data set with incredible detail and all of the information you need to track the data and assess the uncertainty in the information. So let's just show some of the results. A snapshot here in 2019. This is a plot which shows the distribution of CO2 stored by project in color, and they're broadly organized by region or continent. And you can see a large number of projects. There are so many you can't read the names of them. But you also see many colors, which is indicative of an international distribution. The amounts stored, as you'll see, are dominated by projects storing carbon dioxide in oil fields. And there are also varying standards of the reporting. We're able to take this information and summarize the archetypes, if you will, of carbon capture and storage chains. So this is cumulative carbon dioxide captured from 1996 to 2024, a Sankey diagram showing that the carbon dioxide is coming from a variety of sources. This is where it's being captured. However, those sources are dominated by high purity sources: natural gas production, ethanol refineries, all places that produce carbon dioxide at greater than 95% concentration as their output, and a much smaller fraction of carbon dioxide from low purity sources, so flue gas streams. However, that's still a lot of carbon dioxide coming from these sources. And the distribution between oil fields and saline aquifers, again, as shown here. But all of this is to say that we have the information we need now to quantify the climate benefit. Some other trends that we see in the time series of data from 1996 until today are that there are essentially three phases of expansion. Demonstration projects initiating carbon dioxide storage at large scale in 1996 gave rise to an expansion in North America as soon as the 45Q tax credit started incentivizing CO2 storage in the United States. And then finally, a large expansion internationally in China, in the Middle East, in Australia from 2016. But in terms of the impact and the contribution, the numbers tell a very interesting story. So we can track over 384 million tons of carbon dioxide stored since 1996, 45 million tons stored in 2023. To put that in context, is a similar amount of CO2 avoided from the production of around 100 terawatt hours of renewable energy on the UK electricity grid. And that's how much renewable energy was produced by the UK in 2023. So this is a large contribution to climate change mitigation. We see that CO2 storage is growing, but since 2016, we see 9.2% annual growth on average. And if this increases in response to increased incentive and policy framework maturity to 11%, we get to a gigaton per year in 2050. So what does this mean? I'll just jump straight to the conclusions. The geological storage, we can tell a story from this data alone that geological carbon dioxide storage is demonstrated today. It's proven. It's demonstrated at industrial scales with scores of deployments, a variety of geological and industrial settings. And at this stage, there is more than 400 million tons of CO2 stored since 1996. And on top of that, geological carbon dioxide storage is providing climate-relevant mitigation today. It's providing large amounts of mitigation, and it's on the growth trajectory to provide this climate wedge, this gigaton scale of CO2 storage by mid-century. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Sam. It's a really hopeful way to start. And also, I think one of the focuses of the session and the panel discussion after is going to be on what does it take to enhance that growth rate? What do we need to do to accelerate that deployment rate and to get it to the 11% that we need? But Iain's going to tell us a little bit more about those growth rates and trajectories, so over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jen. And here we go. So yeah, thanks everybody for having me speak to you about my research today. So my name's Iain Jonge-Anderson. I'm a research fellow at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And I'll be speaking about CO2 storage requirements and climate. And I specifically work on a project which is called Uptake, which has this lovely colourful logo up here. And this is a Horizon EU research project. It's a large project, about €8 million of funding, 4 years, 20 different organisations. And it looks very holistically at carbon dioxide removal methods, and specifically how these are represented within some of the climate change models that Sam was referring to in his presentation just before. But as someone with a geology background like myself, our role within this project is to look specifically at the storage part, and how do we improve how CO2 storage is represented within these models. And that's essentially what I'll share with you through these slides today. And so I think Sam showed some nice summary plots of some of the projections of how much CO2 storage we might need within the coming decades and up to the end of this century. But we can dig a little bit deeper into some of these numbers here. And this comes from the latest IPCC assessment report, which is from 2022. And it shows some of the amounts of CO2 storage that came as a result of some modelling studies, which I'll come to in a moment. But essentially what they showed was that in order to meet 1.5 degrees by 2100, there's a lot of scatter for the first point. All these little thin grey lines are all the different pathways that we might take to get to 1.5 degrees. But if we just concentrate on median and sort of interquartile range, it's something between 5 and 12 gigatons per year by 2050, expanding to 12 to 20 gigatons per year by 2100. So it's really rapid scale up from the levels that we're at currently. And that translates cumulatively to between 500 and 1,000 gigatons of sequestration by 2100. So this is really significant scale up of the industry. And it's important to think about how actually we arrive at these numbers, because these numbers are important. They make their way into influential reports and scientific publications, and ultimately into policy. And so these numbers are being produced by a family of models, really, called integrated assessment models. There's many of them out there. They're quite complicated. They're quantitative frameworks that take into account a whole different suite of things. But essentially what they do in a nutshell is they take a series of assumptions about the population, GDP, the sort of degree of geopolitical cooperation there may or may not be, and various other different things, including policy, put these into a series of linked modules that essentially simulates the economy, the climate, energy systems, the land systems, and they ultimately predict a series of outcomes, like what does our emissions look like in the coming decades, what does the economy look like, and do we ultimately arrive at that temperature target that we're trying to meet. And they basically simulate a variety of different things, and CO2 storage is just one part of it, but it's an important part of it, and the part that essentially we're concentrating on for our research. And so because they are quite important in terms of the impact of these studies, it's important as scientists to be constantly scrutinizing the outputs and thinking, well, are we representing this sort of scale up of CO2 storage in the best way possible? Is it in line with the current scientific understanding? And so this is something that we went about trying to understand as part of Uptake. And one of the sort of early pieces of work, we went back through a lot of different integrated assessment models and tried to understand exactly how they're constraining CO2 storage. And we found that there's generally 3 different mechanisms, sort of checks and balances that they have to make sure that their numbers are feasible. The first thing they do is that they'll have a limit on the absolute storage capacity of a given region. So that region might be North America, it might be South America, and they will say that the absolute maximum amount of storage you can do within that area is X gigatons. But actually, when we looked at how much they were saying might be a storage capacity within a given area, and how much they were actually predicting could be deployed within sort of the next century or so, they were rarely getting to those amounts. So this isn't a highly influential parameter. I think we're moving away from this. The second assumption that they make is an assumption around cost. So they will typically take a levelized cost of storage, how much, and put that as part of the whole chain of CCS. And there's various different mechanisms by which they do this. They'll have cost curves, fixed curves, learning by doing. But essentially, because these are cost optimization frameworks, they're looking at the optimal way to reach that temperature target this is a very important consideration. It ensures that they're only deploying CCS if it's profitable to do so. And then thirdly, and importantly, they have limits on injection. And this is something that we concentrate on as part of our research at the moment. But actually, how do we ensure that we're not simulating an industry that is expanding way quicker than we've ever seen within other sort of similar technologies? And this is another important checks and balance. So just to expand on a couple of these different points very briefly, I mentioned storage capacity. And so my feeling here is that there is sufficient CO2 storage capacity to be able to accommodate the amount that we're putting into these models. If we look back to the literature, this is, I think, 10 different publications from the past 20 years that have all sought to try and define what the global storage capacity is, which is a very difficult number to arrive at. And you can kind of see that in the lack of agreement, really. There's numbers anywhere between 1,000 or less than 1,000 gigatons and upwards of 50,000 gigatons. And this is really only considering storage within plastic rocks. We're not thinking at all really about the opportunity within Mayfield rocks here. So there's lots of disagreement, but generally speaking, they arrive at something around 10,000 gigatons. And if we look at how much CO2 storage these integrated assessment models, or they're often referred to as IAMs, are predicting, actually 75% of 1.5 degree scenarios are saying that we need about 1,000 gigatons of storage capacity to get there. And all of them require 2,000 gigatons or less. So in other words, that is the sort of far conservative end of these estimates of storage potential, and that's plastic rocks alone. So for us, the more interesting research focus is actually thinking about, well, how do we incorporate our understanding of the effects of injectivity and industry scale-up within these models? And so quite an interesting study came out in 2024 where these authors, they looked at how much CO2 storage scale-up was being predicted in these models, and they compared it against other low-carbon technologies, like solar and wind and the like. And they did this in a quantitative way. They looked at sort of share of market potential down here and compound annual growth rate. And actually what they found was that once you compare the rates of scale up and sort of how fast they were able to deploy the CCS within these IAMs, it far exceeded anything that we could see from historical rates of technology adoption. And that led those authors to essentially say that actually a lot of these scenarios that IAMs are predicting are showing unrealistically high deployment. So that, I mean, this is really important because ultimately this is information that's feeding into policy further down the line. And that led several authors, including authors from Imperial College, to look at actually how do we go about landing on better numbers for that scale up. And so what the research that's coming out of that is generally showing is that actually we're looking at maybe something to do like 4, 5, 6 gigatons per year within the next coming decades. And in other words, that is tracking at the very lower end, really, of all these different scenario pathways that are showing the expansion of CO2 storage. And there's still a lot of uncertainty at what happens when you sort of get into the later part of the century. So that basically brings me to the research that we're doing. So we're putting together a model which is called CO2 Logics. And our sort of aim within this model is to develop new CO2 storage constraints that can be used by the integrated assessment model communities. This is very, very high level modeling. We're looking at this at a sort of regional level, but while accounting for what we refer to as dynamic storage capacity. And what I mean by dynamic storage capacity is that we're interested in looking at how factors that change over time influence that storage capacity. So that could be techno-economic factors, like how fast can that region start a CO2 storage industry? And thinking mainly about drilling rates here, we're thinking about actual drilling of wells. And then secondly, what is the interplay here with the geology? So we're thinking about factors like pressure buildup. If you're injecting into an aquifer and you have overpressure from day one, essentially, to what effect does that change the capacity moving forward, and how is that influenced by the drilling rate? And secondly, injectivity constraints. What happens if you have a formation which is low permeability? You know, it's got narrow pore throats, they're not very well connected. It means you can't push that CO2 into the rock as fast as you may like. So how does that all influence this storage capacity? And that led us to this model called CO2 Logics that we published the framework model back in March, and a sort of example case study for the UK, which is all you can access with that QR code. Well, I've got it later if you want it. But the aim of this isn't really to come up with a nice bespoke model for the UK necessarily, or any other country, but it's actually to try and come up with a model we can deploy at the global scale, come up with these global level insights. So that's the current research that we're doing at the moment, and So I'd love to share a preprint with you, but it's not quite there yet. But essentially, our goal with this is to come up with global limits on injectivity that we can sort of flex according to scenarios. That scenario might be certain countries developing a CO2 storage industry quicker than others. It might be only certain countries doing it and other countries not. So we can explore what happens to our sort of global injection rates over time and essentially storage capacity over time under those scenarios. And because we simulate this on a country by country level, we can then explore, okay, who is leading at a certain point in time? Who are the early adopters? Who are the late adopters? How does that ultimately influence how much the globe is storing over time? So hopefully that research will be available very soon. So if I can just conclude, CO2 storage must scale fast to meet climate targets. I've demonstrated that hopefully, but in other words, we need to be getting up to gigaton scale by 2050, tens of gigaton scale by 2100, going by the latest modelling anyway. But these projections are constantly being scrutinised and updated with the latest scientific understanding, and it's our sort of role as geoscientists, engineers, to sort of help the IAM community with that. There's been a shift, I think, from the focus of looking at absolute static capacity towards injectivity and scale-up in these sort of dynamic problems and how they may influence our pathways. And this is where our outstanding research questions are. And our role within Uptake, the research that we're doing at the moment, is to essentially provide new data for the IAMs that can incorporate these things with a new model, which we term CO2 logics. And ultimately, the end goal is to ensure that these climate change mitigation pathways are feasible and robust. So there's some, I promised more QR codes. There's more QR codes up there. Paper, and the data set for it is open source, so you can go and you can have a play around with it as well and try and break it. And then there's a preprint. And then if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, I tend to publish there when new material is available. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iain. They're beautiful pairing of presentations there, and you start to see why the data sets that people like Sam are compiling are so fundamental for also informing these global policy, not just policy relevant, but policy informing pathways as well. So thank you. We're going to take a logical leap now. That was global perspectives, how we're doing, where things are heading, where the research gaps are, an idea for the sorts of scale up. We're going to now hear from Zoe from NSTA. NSTA have been doing some really interesting kind of changes in how they approach how like the licensing, permitting, and kind of openness of that process as well, engagement with academic teams as well, and looking to answer some of these questions that are being laid out. So I'll say no more. I'll hand over to Zoe. Thank you very much for being here. And you can use that one.
Okay, thanks, Jen. I'm Zoe Sayer. I am a carbon storage stewardship lead at the North Sea Transition Authority, or NSTA, based up in Aberdeen. So work this. There we go. So this is our have to show slide. So the NSTA license, regulate and influence the UK oil and gas, carbon storage and offshore hydrogen industries. Our aim is to realise the enormous potential of the North Sea by accelerating the energy transition, supporting the UK energy security and reducing the emissions from UK production. NSTA don't set policy. That is with DESNZ, just to make that clear at the start. So what is our role in carbon storage? So we're the regulatory authority. We award licences, we make decisions and hopefully award permits, and have done recently, for offshore carbon storage. We also maintain the Carbon Storage Public Register and the National Data Repository. We have a role in decommissioning plans and data retention and disclosure. So that's our overall remit. And in terms of what I do there, I'm part of the stewardship team, and we steward the issued carbon storage licences to permit and beyond. So the team I'm involved with are the ones that look after the licences that have passed site characterisation and are heading towards a permit decision. And we're also stewarding the two projects that have now got permits and are starting to execute their projects, as we saw from Ben yesterday. We also support net zero, and we provide advice and expertise to government in support of policy and regulatory development. And as Jen's already said, we collaborate and coordinate with key external bodies Some of these are independent consultancies, other regulators, and also academia as well, to ensure everybody's aligned and basically singing from the same hymn sheet. A little bit more detail, we play a very important role in ensuring that the CCS sector continues to grow. Well, I say continues to grow quickly. Some people might dispute that it has been growing quickly, but hopefully we started that last year and the year before with the issuing the 4 storage permits, 1 of which went to Endurance and 3 of which went to HyNet. We also launched the second licensing round last December. 14 locations were offered, and we're currently evaluating applications, and those locations had 2 gigaton potential CO2 storage capacity. This builds on the first carbon storage round, which was launched in 2023 and had 21 licenses offered, and site characterisation is actually progressing on 19 licenses, not 22, of which have already been relinquished. And 4 of those were expected to move into initial development planning this year when this slide was written. 2 of them have already passed site characterisation and moved into the assess phase of the project. We also introduced some carbon storage stewardship expectations. Anyone here from industry may be familiar with the hydrocarbon ones, which give operators an understanding of how we expect these licenses to be stewarded and some of the technical work to be carried out on them. And the areas covered in the first 5 are risk appraisal, data technology and stakeholder engagement. We are planning on introducing further stewardship expectations for the execute and operate phase as licenses progress. So where are we today? So the current projects, these are the 4 track projects. The 2 permitted ones are Endurance, which Ben gave a lot of detail on yesterday. So that's CO2 from industries in Teesside and Humberside. This relates to the clusters talk as well, and these 4 projects take from clusters in different parts of the UK. So Endurance at the moment is Teesside in the northeast and expanding to Humberside. HyNet is the northwest cluster around North Wales, Liverpool area, and that actually is going to store CO2 in 3 depleted gas fields in the Liverpool Bay area. That's why it's got 3 separate permits, because you need a permit per site, even if they're all part of the same project. Acorn is the northernmost project to date, and that is looking at storing CO2 from Scottish industry, again offshore into a depleted reservoir reusing the GoldenEye pipeline. And Viking is another one taking from east of England. So that's taking CO2 from industries at Immingham, which is, I think, it's slightly further south than Humberside, and that surrounding area, looking at a new onshore pipeline, existing pipeline out to depleted gas reservoir in the old Victor field. So, a variety of stores here. So I should have pointed out, Endurance is the only saline aquifer store at the moment. The others are all depleted fields, but there are more saline aquifer potential stores in the first round licenses that are currently going up to site characterisation. So how did these projects get there, and what do you need to do? Oh, sorry, had a lag. What do you need to do to get a permit? So the carbon storage licence has several terms, and these terms are divided into phases. So when you get a licence, you go into the appraisal term, and that has 3 phases: appraise, assess and define, and a permit decision is made at the end of define. The appraise phase is where you do your early risk assessment. You look at the risk. Legacy wells are a very big part of this. Is the data suitable for assessment for site characterisation? What are your seals like? What are your reservoirs like? So, a lot of static characterisation is done during the appraise phase. More data collected, seismic shots, reprocessed, appraisal wells drilled, like the one on the Endurance field. And there was also one drilled on the Hewitt field. Injection tests like have been carried out by Perenco last year. And that's overall to give you an evaluation of the suitability of the proposed storage site. So the idea is, with these different phases, that if a project looks likely to fail, it will fail fast. We don't keep working things that aren't going to work, because that is not a good use of everybody's time. And that's part of stewardship. It's stewarding what work is done by the operators and guiding operators through the different license phases. So once the site and complex have been characterised, you go into the assess phase, and that's basically concept select. So during this phase, you develop your CO2 transportation and the facilities complex, and further develop your subsurface understanding. So refining static models with appraisal data, and building a full dynamic model during this phase. And at the end of the assess phase, your site and complex characterisation and concept select report should all be finalised. The licences that are currently in assess phase are Acorn, and then 2 of the first round licences that recently moved into assess. And define phase is where the permit application is made. So this should be fully optimised. There may be final tweaks made to data models, etc. at the start of define, but then partway into define, you have a define phase review where the licensee comes and talks to us, and we look at whether they're ready to apply for their storage permit and prepare their documents. Once they've got a permit, they move into the execute phase, which is where HyNet and Endurance are, and that's where the development is built. And we saw some lovely pictures from Endurance yesterday. HyNet are also progressing pretty quickly with their building, which is great. And then the operating plan is finalised. We're not there yet, but when we move into the operate phase, that's when everything starts being injected. The CO2 starts to be injected. There are requirements to do regular monitoring, there are requirements for metering, and there's obviously requirements for maintenance. And then once the store reaches the end of its life, which will be well after I've retired, all being well, you go into the post-closure phase where there's decommissioning and then continued monitoring to check the CO2 plume has been permanently stored. So we've been talking about the pace of permits, the fact that they've been fairly slow to date. And, you know, what are we doing to actually help speed up this process? So last couple of slides are just what remains the same and what has changed. So what does remain the same is that we operate under the UK regulatory regime, and the requirements in the 2010 regulations must be met. So we don't have any flexibility around that. We can't ignore parts of it. There are the aspects in the regulation we still have to meet. In order to meet those, we ask applicants to submit 7 documents. We have removed one. It was 8 for the track ones. We've removed one, which we realised was a lot of repetition. So the future licences will be 7 documents, and these are aimed to meet the regulatory requirements. So there's a containment risk assessment, which demonstrates no significant risk of leakage, harm to human health, or harm to the environment. And those 3 are stated in the regs that we have to consider in order to make a permit decision. The site and complex have to be fully characterised, and they also have to be defined, because those definitions affect the assessment of risk and the definitions of leakage or migration from the site and complex. The carbon storage development plan, that's how the project will be developed, and that also includes operational limits, which are again required by regulation. There is a maximum injection limit specified in the regulations. And then to check where the CO2 goes and fix anything, like hopefully it doesn't go to a leak, but any significant irregularity like non-model conformance. There's the monitoring plan and the associated corrective measures plan, again required by regulations. Provisional post-closure plan is obviously fairly light at the permit application stage, but we need to have an idea of roughly how the facilities will be decommissioned, how long, are any facilities required to stay in place for post-closure monitoring? And then finally, the financial security, how's it going to be paid for? Alongside these, the storage operator also has to demonstrate competency, and there are other regulator approvals such as OPRED, Crown Estate or Crown Estate Scotland, and then environmental agencies such as NRW, and then the equivalent Scottish and English bodies. What's changed? So we have issued 4 permits. I'm going to keep saying that. It's a good news story. We did it. It's great. We're on the way to first injection, hopefully. After those were issued, we had after-action reviews, both internally and with the HyNet and Endurance teams who were involved in this, and we discussed what worked well and what needed changing. And some of our changes, like the removal of the document, have been implemented from this. We had a lot of learnings from these projects, and though we can't publish them, what we are doing is we are carrying these learnings across into the stewardship of the Track 2 projects and the first round licenses. So though you haven't seen anything published from us, if you're involved in a CS project, you will be learning from us how to, the stewardship from that we do incorporates those learnings. So we're stewarding towards quality deliverables and trying to front end load some of the technical review, so it's not all done after storage permit application. One in particular is the well assessment, which we are bringing right to the start of the projects. It's one of the most important things in the appraise phase is legacy well assessment, because that's one of the biggest risks of leakage for these stores. So, and then, and that's all part of the fail fast. If your legacy wells are going to leak, there is no point in doing a big subsurface geological dynamic characterisation because the store won't work. We've also updated our guidance. I was in charge of that. It was a lot of work. They should be published in a couple of months, and these provide more clarity for licensees. The initial piece of guidance was fairly light, and the feedback we received from the Track 1 projects was there wasn't enough detail. So it's going in with more detail, and it also encompasses the other licence phases, so you understand what's needed at the end of each licence phase to progress into the next. And we've obviously incorporated the Track 1 learnings into that as well, as to some requirements which maybe weren't clear for Track 1. They should be much clearer for the licenses coming forward, so that we can progress quicker with less back and forth and iteration. We've also published the data. There've also been the data disclosure and retention requirements have come into force, which helps licensees understand what they need to do for their data. And then I've already mentioned the stewardship expectations. And then finally, there's been a lot of work done on the National Data Repository, which has a lot of publicly available well data that future projects can access and use to help characterise their stores. And that's it. Thank you very much.
So it's amazing to see how things have been changing and to hear about that stewardship around what you're doing as well to help to accelerate and to learn. I will also just do a bit of a shout out. We do have one of our focused fund projects was on that legacy well risk assessment pieces of work, and we do have a webinar planned for later this year. Mel, I'm sure, will be advertising details, so keep a lookout for those. We'll be having these webinars about all of our focused funding projects. But right now, you want to hear from Nick, who's our next speaker, who's taking, we're narrowing down, we're now going from the UK level to a project level, and we're thinking outside the clusters. We're thinking about another depleted gas field. I think we're talking about the Le Mans, or injecting into Le Mans. I won't make any spoilers. I'll hand over to Nick to tell you about all this really interesting stuff and that kind of learning by doing from there. So over to you.
Great, thank you for that introduction. So let's talk about our Poseidon project. So this is the one of the first carbon storage license awards. So this is the next wave coming through. So we're kind of in that kind of coming out of the appraise phase into that kind of assess and define phase, looking to kind of seek permit approval, within the next 12 months or so. So my name's Nick Terrell. I'm one of the co-founders and directors at Carbon Catalyst. We're a transport and storage project developer, and we're kind of like the early stage kind of architect of this concept, which we then brought to Perenco, our operator, and we also brought Wintershall Dea into the project, and now Harbour Energy. So we're essentially an early stage developer. We have an equity position in the project. Albeit it's only 10%. So what I wanted to talk about here really was the injection test that we decided to do last year as part of our work program. This is the first CO2 injection test in the UK, and quite a unique test globally in terms of injecting liquid phase CO2 into an ultra depleted gas reservoir in an offshore setting. So this is the test that we undertook. It's a depleted gas field, I think as was mentioned earlier. So you can see essentially our jack-up rig, which has the injection package on it. That's the big red unit, and then we have the the normally unmanned gas production wellhead platform on the right, and so that's been producing gas. It no longer produces gas, and we did an injection test through the wells from that platform. Okay, and then you can see the vessel on the left there, which is the supply vessel with the white tanks in there, which are the liquid CO2 tanks that we transported off to the site. This is a private joint venture funded project, so we've spent well over £50 million on this. This has not been subsidised by government in any way whatsoever, so this is very much an enterprise-driven project. We're obviously here to fix the planet, but we're also here to make money. And if we can't make money, then the sector won't deploy ultimately, because we need to mobilise private capital. Okay, and so that's our driver here. We've got a couple of other licenses, 3 other licenses also awarded in the first carbon storage licensing round. So we have the Orion project just off Humber, and then what I'm talking about here, if I can get the laser pointer to work. Hang on, let me just see. Here we go. Yeah. That's the Orion project. What I'm talking about here is the Poseidon project. Okay, so this is just off the coast of East Anglia in England, and the Bacton gas processing terminal, which is a major piece of gas production infrastructure for the UK. So I'm presenting Prenco slides here, our operator slides. You know, Prenco is one of the biggest producers of gas in the UK. They're also a pretty large global portfolio. They produce around about 25% of BP's oil and gas production globally, so they're a big entity. You may not have heard of them because they're private and family owned, but you know, you need big companies with big balance sheets to develop these types of projects. The strategy that we're adopting here really is to seek to reuse and repurpose existing hydrocarbon production infrastructure. Okay, so rather than putting in new, very expensive bits of metal, we're seeking to reuse existing gas production infrastructure, essentially. And we're looking to repurpose reservoirs. So in Poseidon's case, it's the Le Mans depleted gas field. This is the UK's largest legacy gas field, just shy of 15 TCF of gas in place, with a total theoretical storage capacity of around about 1 gigaton. So it's a huge store. However, it's all broken up and compartmentalized, and so it's split into fault segments, and so we can develop the field segment by segment. Okay, bottom right there is the license timeline, CS009 license timeline. So we have the license awarded by Zoe and her colleagues in the middle of 2023. We're through the early risk assessment work, big focus on legacy wells, etc. It's all kind of milestoned from a regulatory perspective and a project perspective. And we've now progressed through the site characterization phase, which included a lot of data acquisition and including this injection test that we undertook early last year. We're now essentially through site characterization. We've submitted our report to Zoe and her colleagues, and we're now moving into the assess phase. We've also conducted at the project level the kind of pre-feed work. So we have a concept select, which I'll talk to in a moment in terms of the initial phase of the project. So the Le Mans field is, as I mentioned, it's a very large field. In the sort of mid-70s, it was producing around about 40% of the UK gas demand, so it's a world-class gas field. It's got 15 platforms. Here are some examples. Over 200 wells, mostly still producing very small puffs of gas or suspended, awaiting decommissioning. And as I mentioned before, it's highly compartmentalized. So there's around about 25 hydraulically isolated fault compartments within the field, massive thick sands, and a pretty good reservoir quality as well. It's also ultra depleted. So we're looking at about 14 bar, so around about 200 psi reservoir pressure. So very, very low pressure, and with a huge amount of production infrastructure, production history, data, etc. that we can use to leverage. However, we also wanted to make sure that we could get some CO2 injection data. So you know, the industry lacks empirical data, and so we wanted to go out there and get the empirical data, and that was the justification for the injection test. So UK is a net importer of CO2, so it was extraordinarily expensive to secure CO2. So we needed around about 4,000 tonnes of liquid CO2 that we needed to purchase on the market. So we went to the Netherlands, to LE Keyd, who gave us a reasonable discount. They could only guarantee supply of the CO2 in the winter because they're selling their CO2 to the German beverage market in the summer. So really they couldn't guarantee supply from April onwards, because that's when the Germans start to drink their lager beer. So we had to do the operations in the winter, which obviously adds a weather risk and cost, and that's why we configured the injection test the way we did, which I'll talk about in a moment. So the CO2 was transported around about 80 kilometers to the Vlissingen port in the Netherlands, and then was shipped across in 20-foot cryogenic isotanks, or standards of industrial gas tanks, out to the storage site into the UK, where it was then offshore. It was then unloaded via a flexible hose into a tank farm that we installed on a temporary platform, the Erda platform in here, that sits next to the wellhead platform. Okay, so the operations were 3 months, starting in February. We did 10 liquid CO2 transfers with the vessel. We did 15 injection cycles, gaseous phase, supercritical phase, and liquid phase ultimately. So half of those 15 CO2 injection cycles are essentially liquid CO2 phase, and multi-phase as well. And we injected 3,500 tons of CO2 into the reservoir via the well. Okay, so a big, complicated, first of a kind, cross-border supply chain that we set up purely for this experiment, essentially. Okay, so all kind of pre-funded as pre-development funding, right? So this is all at-risk capital, essentially. So what did we learn? So one of the big learnings was that multi-phase injection seems to not really be that problematic for this type of reservoir and setting. So we were able to inject over 1 MTPA without any issues. That's actually facilities constrained. We were constrained by our offshore safety case. We probably could have been injecting at maybe up to 2 million tons per annum in the well. So good injectivity. Whilst we started in liquid phase, we moved quite quickly onto that kind of multi-phase line on the PT plot. And so there'd been quite a lot of concern in the literature and historically, based on modelling, mostly from oil and gas, in reality, in terms of data inputs to the modelling, that multi-phase flow and CO2 would create all sorts of issues around flow assurance, etc. We didn't see any of that, and we were able to measure a lot of that through a very extensive data acquisition program. So we had fibre optics in the well, pressure gauges at various different stages within the well as well. So really good that we can inject at high rates and multi-phase, because that means that we can do a cost-effective development. Essentially, we can have a low wellhead pressure and not have to put a lot of kit offshore, essentially, to condition the CO2 from a temperature perspective in particular. It's an experiment, so we were pushing the envelope. So we reduced the wellhead temperature down to minus 12.5 degrees Celsius, and the CO2 was flashing into the reservoir. We were getting Joule-Thomson cooling effects, but we were really trying to push to see how cold we could get the reservoir to go, and we couldn't get it to less than plus 13 degrees Celsius when injecting at the high rate. So below the kind of hydrate appearance zone. We were also doing a lot of passive seismic monitoring for thermal fracturing. We didn't see any of that kind of stuff either. So intermittent injection, we were sort of injecting in sort of 400-ton batches, right? So this is not sort of reflecting potentially the kind of continuous injection that you'd see in the sort of longer term commercial deployment phase, but certainly in terms of sort of intermittent injection, really helpful, useful data set that was gathered there. And it appears that we've got a relatively straightforward setup moving to the commercial phase now. So this is what we're doing in phase 1. So we will shortly announce a contract from a UK large energy from waste emitter. This will be our anchor emitter in the UK providing 700,000 tonnes of CO2 per annum. And we'll, as a project, will be operating the energy from waste plant sits right next to the marine terminal. We'll be taking the CO2 via vessel. We'll be operating the vessel, 7,500 tonne vessel, take that CO2 offshore to the storage site and do offshore unloading, basically. So that's the kind of plan there. We'll convert 2 injector wells just for redundancy, and we'll be transporting the CO2 in medium pressure phase. So essentially transferring the CO2 from the vessel via a flexible riser, short pipeline. We'll be using ambient seabed temperature to warm the CO2 up from minus 27 degrees Celsius roughly to roughly 0 degrees. And then, replicating the injection test will be then injecting the CO2 down the wellhead from that temperature profile. And we'll be doing obviously a bunch of monitoring to track the pressure and the CO2 plumes. On that point, because we have a very large well stock, we can convert existing legacy gas production wells that are currently waiting to be P&A'd. They're not producing gas anymore. We can use them as monitor wells. So we can do a lot of well-based monitoring, which is really, really powerful, blending that with some bespoke seismic techniques as well. Okay. So the idea here really is to get the permit in quite soon, and driven by the timeline of our emitter, we'll be looking to take FID potentially towards the back end of next year, which would see us operational in about 2030 in that initial phase. And then the plan is then to scale the project. Initially through shipping, we're now seeing the opening, or starting to see the announcements on policies around opening the international boundary with EU member states, for instance, Belgium particularly. We can start to bring in CO2 from there. We have a 100 million tonne pipeline of emitters that are wanting to get the CO2 to Poseidon. So the policy is crucial to unlocking that. And then we can scale it, ultimately bringing it up to the full field potential of 40 million tonnes per annum, which is massive, obviously. That will be needed to be done via pipeline. So that's really the vision. And why we honed in on this project specifically in Le Mans is that this is one of the most southern storage sites in the North Sea, and as you can see on the map there, is really strategically positioned to service a whole range of different customers. So for us, the timeline really is driven by CO2 supply. We have lots of wells. We can just move across and recomplete wells and develop the field incrementally. That's relatively straightforward. It's all about syncing the storage development with the CO2 supply. And CO2 supply and the cost of capture is ultimately driving the timeline of this project. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. A really optimistic, forward-looking presentation there from something, again, outside the clusters, which is something we wanted to bring to this audience today. So what we started about 10 minutes late, so we're going to be having this panel discussion now through till about 10:50, and then we can have our break and get coffee and so on. But for now, can I invite our speakers to come up to that area? Just get your chair. Take that one.
Yeah, sure.
Turn it on.
Yeah.
Yep.
I will help.
Yeah.
Yes.
Stuart.
So I'm Stuart Haszeldine from University of Edinburgh. I'm going to try and chair this interactive session. So we've heard several different talks on a huge range of global, local, individual size scales. And we're now really at the transition, I think, from theoretical storage evaluations to practical storage outcomes. So that's quite a change that we've been waiting for in a way for several years. So but this still gives us several problems to try and tackle. So I'm going to ask Sam, first of all, You've done a very good analysis of compiling all this information, and you derive from that this problem scale-up. So, from your perception, looking at that very high level data, what can be done to accelerate that scale-up? Now, that's the similar sort of question to what people we go down. But first of all, from your global scale, how does that work?
Yeah, I think as far as learning about what leads to growth, there are some really interesting lessons that come out of the data set. And in addition to the variety of geological settings and industrial settings, we actually have a variety of economic settings or business models being used. So in the United States and to some extent in Canada, the growth is being driven by a market-based policy mechanism, and that's happened very quickly over the last 10 years or so of the 45Q, and so that provides a very a positive message for the value of that. Of course, that was built on top of a decade or so of direct funding for demonstration projects. So it's not to say that the policy mechanism is superior, but clearly where you've had a lot of activity and demonstration and research in place, the market-based policy mechanism can really unlock that growth. At the same time, a lot of very successful deployments around the world. And in general, the performance of these projects and especially the environmental integrity, there are no projects that have had any CO2 leaking, there are no projects that have induced felt seismicity. Those probably all speak to the policy and environments in which these projects have been built.
So if I challenge you a little bit on that briefly, you talked about creating a market mechanism, and that makes 45Q, but I still regard 45Q as a subsidy, because the federal government is foregoing the tax income, therefore providing a subsidy. So is there how do you see a true liquid commercial ready-to deploy market actually developing?
Yeah, I think, I'll make a comment, and I think, maybe some of the panel members could answer more thoroughly on that. But I think the important thing to see is that there are different business environments in which CCS is being carried out successfully. Essentially, direct mandates and direct government support in China, in the Middle East, in a way, in South America. And here in the UK, of course, we're seeing in Europe in general this growth in projects that are on the verge of injecting CO2 underground. I think you see the Net Zero Industry Act coming from Europe, which is more of a mandate, but it's clearly pushing a lot of interest. I'd be interested to hear if the customer base is increasing as a result of that. You'd expect it. And the important thing to keep in mind is that these policy frameworks, to some extent, have to reflect the political situation on the ground, public acceptance in the United States. Financial incentive was valuable and worked. In Europe, mandates and taxes may be more viable politically.
Iain, you in your presentation, you came out with a number which I thought a growth of about 9% a year in terms of projects. 9% a year growth. And 9% a year growth is pretty good, but not like 15 or 18% like for solar PV historically has been the classical case of ultra rapid unique growth. So is 9% growth sustainable? How would your analysis show that could be not a derivation but a policy to achieve 9% growth?
I think 9% growth was maybe in Sam's slides, but I'm happy to answer the question anyway. But essentially, yeah, I agree that's on the lower end. It's maybe not an element from my research particularly, but more like a theme that I kind of have seen from yesterday and today, that actually it's about trying to take lessons learned from some of these initial projects and translating them and that will ultimately help us improve those growth rates. And I think Zoe mentioned it in her slides about learning the lessons from those first clusters. It was in Ben's talk. It's about ensuring that those lessons make their way into the sort of broader environment for the next group to come along and improve.
Country like the UK. Good for an organised country like the UK, but I don't know, Nick, when you devise your project, that's a truly commercial project, but if somehow you've managed to convince insurance companies or the family curators of the wealth in Poseidon and Krevor to actually invest in that. So how did you overcome that barrier? Have they taken a higher risk? Are they looking for a very rapid growth, which means a very rapid return? How does your singular example translate into a global growth?
Yeah, I mean, so our project is a transport and storage project, right? Purely, but for us to take FID, we need our emitters to take FID simultaneously on their capture projects. All capture projects currently of this type of scale need support mechanisms, CFDs, subsidies, what have you. So our initial phase will need support from the government. So we're going through the comprehensive spending review next year. So our emitter can fund its capture project because it's an energy from waste plant with wafer thin margins, essentially, right? But on our side, we're our DNA, or certainly Perenco's DNA, should I say, is a kind of merchant oil and gas producer, right? And so their view is if we can be the lowest cost transporter and storer in the market, we can scale and we can turn this into a profitable business for us under a kind of merchant model. So we're entering into a commercial agreement with our emitter, but our emitter is still benefiting from a subsidy, and so therefore indirectly we're benefiting from a subsidy as well. For our model, because we're repurposing existing infrastructure, our capex is a fraction of the other projects that we're seeing within the kind of Northwest European ecosystem, with the exception of probably kind of Ineos's Green Sand project. But all the other projects are multi-billion-pound projects. Ours are literally an order of magnitude less, so we are risking less capital, and so therefore we can take more risk. But in terms of our investors, I mean, these are large private companies that want to grow in the carbon management space and are willing to risk capital at this stage. And I think there's only a few models that are willing, companies that are capable of kind of doing that type of thing.
I'll ask another question. So if anyone's got a question from the audience, you have to raise your hand and go through it. So you talked about how you're translating lessons learned from track 1 into track 2, but that's sort of slightly concealed, sounded like that was still slightly concealed within the NSTA rather than published. And so what Nick's just spoken about is being able to take learnings and then scale up to true commercialisation. So how do you see that working into the future?
Yeah, so obviously as NSTA we steward various different projects, but we can't share, because confidentiality, we can't share learnings directly from one project saying this X project did this, therefore you should try it. We can't do that, but what we can do is during our stewardship, we have all those examples and all those learnings in our heads, so we can use that during stewardship. But one thing which would really benefit the whole CS industry would be industry collaboration. And there are some limits on that because of anti-competition law. But, Nick shared some of the injection test learnings today. Examples like that to show, just the comment like we couldn't get the reservoir to go really cold. Just little learnings like that are shared between different operators who have tried out different things during their appraisal. That will benefit everybody.
So you're saying that the actual learning, the soft communication that we did it and it worked, there's a few numbers that Nick put in is worth the translation. We don't need the complete curve of pressure history over 2 months.
It's way outside my technical area, but potentially yes. So the soft communication is definitely helps learning. If companies are willing to talk to each other, and there are various task forces for CO2, If companies can talk to each other and share learnings, share, potentially even share data, then that would be highly beneficial.
Right, go to the audience now. They're on the edge of memory. Can you say who you are as well, please?
My name is Osama Salim. I'm an electrical engineer. My question is that we know that fossil fuel, carbon dioxide, and other gases have naturally existed in the subsurface for millions of years. And that is a natural process, and we know that their formation took millions of years. As we are injecting carbon dioxide artificially in the subsurface, and that amount is going to increase massively in the future. So how confident we are that this injection won't affect the dynamics and chemistry of the subsurface? And secondly, we know that excess of carbon dioxide is an issue in the atmosphere. So is it going to be the next problem, that excess of carbon dioxide in the subsurface, if we keep on injecting a lot in the subsurface?
I'm happy to start with that one. So as part of the permit application, the licensees have to do some chemical studies to demonstrate how the CO2 is going to react with the reservoir, how it will react with the seals, if it will come in contact with and react with the underburden. So that's part of our technical consideration. And we have to be comfortable that those chemical reactions aren't going to jeopardize the storage and the seal capacity. The aspect of too much CO2 in the subsurface, I think given the size of the whole subsurface, just thinking about the North Sea and the actual relatively small areas that it is possible to store CO2, as a geologist, I can't see that becoming a big problem. If you look at the amount of oil and gas we've produced from the North Sea, and if you calculated the actual volume of those fields compared to the whole subsurface, then I think that the fraction is actually quite small. But I will pass on to another panellist who wants to take this one next. No? Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Examples whereby CO2 has been measured and been injected into porous aquifers and oil fields and been done successfully. Anybody else on the panel say or take?
But just very briefly, I mean, we have plenty of examples of very high CO2 accumulations that oil and gas companies have drilled, and disappointingly, they've been disappointed and walked away because it's CO2 and it's not commercial. But these fields, the CO2 has been sitting there for tens of millions of years. So we also have some long-term analogues as to how the subsurface interacts with high concentrations of CO2. Yeah.
Mathieu Lucchio, UKCCSRC. It's a question about knowledge sharing. So obviously we had a great presentation here from Poseidon, and thank you for being willing to share some of those results and first of a kind test. I think my question is it's about knowledge sharing. And we're about to set up this industry. We have many projects. You have anti-competition law, but in other industries you also have knowledge sharing between projects. You have institutions that basically organize users group and make sure that the industry can come together and discuss some of the lessons. So who do you think should be the sort of the institution that would facilitate knowledge sharing for sort of CO2 storage in the UK? Who would be the right organisation to take on that role?
I can start if you want. Yeah, I mean, I'm never a fan of the sort of top-down hand of God coordinating everything, right? I think in the UK we have a network of systems, etc. I think, and I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole too far, but the Track 1 projects are massively state-subsidized projects, and they're out there presenting information. The NST obviously gets everything, but there's not as much information coming out that maybe could be, particularly into the academic community. That being said, they are working and collaborating like we are with a range of different academic institutions, research institutions, a range of different stakeholders. We all have NDAs with each other. We're all exchanging information, just so you're aware. I won't go more than that, otherwise I get into trouble. But the NSTA has a really important role to play. This is not the doing of the NSTA at all around maybe some of the lack of information that we're getting out of these early projects. But the NSTA has a really crucial role to talk about what's going on, to share not only amongst the projects themselves, which you're doing through the stewardship process, etc. And we see this firsthand, that it's really working. But they also have a role to share it more widely and also to promote the sector as well, not only just within our little bubble, but also more widely to the public where possible, and also to international investors as well to promote the North Sea. So it's happening. I encourage anyone to come and talk to me about this project, but also other projects that we're progressing and moving forward in the second carbon storage licensing round. So please come and talk. But it is happening. But I think we just need to continue to push it on all fronts.
That's still true. So the NSTA, I think, has a critical data curation, but also, if you like, a marketing value creation role, which isn't adequately realised. And in case anybody hasn't realised, as well as the UKCCSRC, a couple of meetings here, there's plenty of commercial conferences out there now that exchanging the information they want to exchange.
Yes, if I can just respond from the NSTA, we are trying to encourage companies to share with each other, with the public. We're encouraging companies to publish papers so that the data is out there. But we can lead a horse to water, but we can't make it drink. And because some of these projects are quite commercially sensitive, or they're perceived to be commercially sensitive by the companies, that data maybe isn't necessarily, the knowledge sharing rather than data, because the data goes into the National Data Repository, that isn't necessarily being shared as widely as we would maybe like. And I think one of the issues with this is that a lot of the companies come from an oil and gas background where it's very much keep intellectual property tight to your chest. You don't share learnings because it might give somebody else an advantage. And I think the carbon storage industry, because I guess it is effectively waste disposal, we've talked about the need for subsidies, that maybe the mindset needs to shift. I think we're starting to see that, but it's going to take some time.
Okay, take one more question. Brian, do you have a question? Is there a question back in the room? We'll play it back in the room. Brian, do you have a question? Yeah. Okay. Say who you are again.
Yeah.
All right. Sorry.
You asked first.
Oh, it looks like I got in first. I'm Owen Tucker from Shell. Hello. It's going to be short. No, because there are. The question is, why does Norway seem to do this knowledge sharing better? Didn't they just have this 20-year celebration in Trondheim of the academic community having sharing events and sharing all the CCS information? We've been around for 20 years, but I think the UK doesn't place as much stress and emphasis on what the UKCCSRC achieves. So what's Norway doing better? Panel, and what can we learn from them?
Norway have actually been injecting for 40 years, so they have learnings from active projects. So I'm hoping that once we do start injecting in the UK, then the companies will want to shout about what they're doing, and that learning will kick off. And I'm now going to pass to someone else, because you've heard my voice far too much. Somebody global. Who's global?
Do we have another question from you?
Oh, go on then. So observation first and then a quick question. So up and down, we've seen up and down the value chain today from capture and yesterday, capture, transport and storage. It strikes me that the storage end of the value chain has the most capital to deploy in these projects. And that we've heard today there's no shortage of storage space. So really, we need to get the emitters, the economics down there in order for them to become part of the value chain in this market-based mechanism. As you said, most of them are still reliant on government intervention in some way. So one mechanism is carbon dioxide removals, but that's predicated on certain projects like EFW and bioenergy. What other mechanisms are out there that we can utilise to actually drive down the cost of capture for these emitter projects and utilise the storage space and the storage projects that are willing to come on stream and develop the capital around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, where you see carbon capture and storage and even removals projects growing in a sustained way are places where they've achieved liftoff with a policy mechanism, usually market-based, that has been established and has grown successively, so that there's some confidence that this is happening and it's going to be continued over the lifetime of projects. So you see a lot of organizations coming into the space where that's happening. I think, you know, that we haven't quite got there in the UK, but the confidence that's been built up both by the research expertise and now the track cluster process and the prior competitions has clearly created an anticipation that this business environment is about to open up. That's why we see license rounds being oversubscribed. That's why we see, I guess, customers for projects that can be wholly financed without the government. I think the next step there, and this is all in the roadmap from we see from the UK government, is to get to the point where we do have more of a market-based policy mechanism. But you do need that policy there to underpin it. There does need to be a price in some form that unlocks the business case for capturing carbon dioxide in storage.
Can I just add to that briefly? So very quickly, yeah. I mean, this is obviously very black and white, but the single biggest challenge for CCS deployment is the cost of capture. Now, how do you get the cost of capture down? You do projects and you learn, right? And that's what we're doing. We're doing it too slowly, but you know, the policy is helping. At the moment, policy is really enabling this stuff. But you know, as we get more projects, we'll learn. We've got new technologies coming through. We have the Chinese. I was on a trip with John Gibbons recently in China. It's amazing what they're doing with their world-class manufacturing supply chain. We get that cost down sufficiently. We have a stable price. Right? It doesn't need to be crazy, but we need a stable price, and then it'll take off. CDRs are an opportunity, but it's voluntary dominated. It's a weak market. It's a shallow market, so we can't fully rely on that. But I think that's where we need to get to. We need more projects, and we need to get the cost of capture down. The transport and storage bit, in most cases, is a second order issue, I would argue, and that's biased on because of my project probably.